Today I will show you how to create this cool login form inside of HTML and CSS. You can enter your email, name and password and press the login button. So let's start by creating a form. Our form will have the ID of maybe form minus container. And inside of this form, we will have an h2 that, for example, says login. Right below this login, let's start by creating all of the input fields by saying, for example, input of type email is our first input. This one will have a name of email, an ID of email, and a placeholder of maybe email. Now we will have an input of type text that will, for example, have the name, ID will be name, and the placeholder will also be name, for example. Now we also want to get the password of the user, so we will have an input of type password with the name password, ID will be password, and placeholder will also be password. So right below we might have a text that says already have an account ? And if the user already has an account, let's say we can redirect him to a register page, for example. Now let's put those two inside of a div because we want to have them next to each other in a moment. And right below, let's create a button of type submit to submit our form. And right here, we will have the text login, for example. Now let's use some classes to style all of those input elements. Let's first of all say we want to have a class of form minus input for all of our input elements. So we will copy this class and give this class to all of our input elements. And our button will have a class of maybe input minus btn, and this div will, for example, have a class of change to register minus container. So that is probably a pretty long name, but let's start by styling our form input elements. So let's go into our style sheet and let's say we are targeting form minus input. We will have a width of 100%. We will have a padding of 15 pixels and we will have a background of maybe RGBA 255, 255, 255, and let's use 0.1 for example. We also want to have a border of 0 and a border radius of 10 pixels. Now let's also start to style the placeholder right here by using : placeholder. We want to have a color for those placeholders of RGBA 255, 255, 255, and 0.8. So we have some form of gray. So let's use 0.6. Now let's also start to style our login text, and we want to have this one in the center and a little bit bigger and wide. So we can do so by saying we are going to go to our form container and we are targeting our h2 element. So let's say the color is white, the font size is maybe 50 pixels, text align is center. So now our text is aligned to the center. And now let's also target our form container, which is the wrapper for everything else. So we say padding of maybe 40 pixels. We want to have a width of 80%, but a max width of maybe 700 pixels. Inside of this form container, we have all of those elements. So let's give them a certain gap. Or let's use a gap between those items by using display flex. Obviously, this is not what we want, so we say flex direction is equal to column. And now let's add a gap of 10 pixels between all of those items, so it looks a little bit better. Let's also say we want to create a background of RGBA. We are going to use 255, 255, 255, 0.1. So we have this background. We use a border minus radius of maybe 15 pixels for the entire form. We use a backdrop filter of blur of 15 pixels, or let's just use 5 pixels or 3 pixels, because as you can see it looks pretty strong. Also let's start to give a border of 1 pixel solid, and we use RGBA again of 255, 255, 255, 0.1, and obviously you can adjust the opacity of this color, and maybe 0.2 looks a little bit better. I also think we can use a little bit more padding right here of 60 pixels. Also, it would be pretty cool if we would have a box shadow behind our card of maybe 10 pixels, maybe a softness or a blur of 25 pixels, and RGBA of 0, 0, 0, and let's use 0.4 for the strength. So now we have this cool blur, and this makes the form look a little more three-dimensional in my opinion. You can also try to give the same box shadow to your input field and test if this looks kind of right, but obviously you would need to use a slightly more subtle version of the same shadow and maybe just like 10 pixels and then 0.2 for the strength of the shadow, or 0.1 even. And this could look kind of right. So feel free to use it if you want to, or feel free to just delete it if you don't want to use that one. So now we are going to style this text right here. And obviously we need to use a class that we already created. And we are going to target this class and we'd say we want to have display of flex, justify content of central. Now we also want to maybe have a color of white, and let's say we want to have a font size of maybe 1 rem, or let's use 1.2 rem. That's probably a little bit too much, but I think it works. Yeah, 1.1 rem is probably all right. So now we also want to have a slight gap between our register icon and our text. So we use 10 pixels, for example. And now we obviously want to have this register here in a bold font, for example. So we can say class is equal to change link, for example. We are going to copy this change link and we are going to target that one and say we want to have a color of white, for example, and a font weight of bold. So now we have this big button basically, and I'd go for 5 pixels right here. Obviously you can decide whether you want to have this underline or not. If you don't want this underline, you can use text decoration of none, and now you have it in a slightly different look. Let's also target our button, so our input button, by using .input button. And I think first of all we should obviously add some padding to the top and to the bottom. So let's maybe use 15 pixels. We can use a border minus radius of maybe 10 pixels. Border should maybe be 0. Let's use margin top of maybe 20 pixels to get some margin between those register switch buttons and the button. I think font size of 1 rem would basically be a little bit better. We can use width of fit content, for example, and then we could also say, okay, now we have padding top bottom of 15 pixels, and let's use 50 pixels for that one. And obviously you could decide whether you want to have the button to the left, to the center, or to the right, or whether you want to have it full width or like this, but I think this looks pretty good. So I'm also going to add a cursor of pointer. I do a background of maybe RGBA, again 255, 255, 0.1. And now we can say we want to have a color of maybe white and a font minus weight of maybe bold. So we now have this button that you can click to log in. Now this here also looks pretty bad, so we are going to change our form input as well by saying we want to have outline of 0 and color of white for the text. And now we have this white text effect, as you can see. And I think like this form looks pretty much alright.